What if I told you that the financial reality that you're living in as an American could completely shift when you move to France? I'm Susie, I'm American, and I've been living and working here in Dijon, France since 2008. There are certain money beliefs that I had that I just don't think about anymore because they simply no longer apply to me. When Americans ask me about moving here or retiring in France, I realize how deeply ingrained these financial assumptions are in the American psyche. And for good reason. They're true in the US, and I had them too. So today I'm breaking down 5 money assumptions that I had that I've realized just don't totally hold true here in France. But before we get started, I just wanted to mention that you can sign up for my email newsletter by scanning the QR code here or by clicking on the link in the video description below to get more practical information about life in France delivered directly to your email inbox. All right, let's get into it. Okay, assumption number 1, you need $1 million or millions of dollars saved in order to be able to retire comfortably. I consume a lot of American personal finance content, and I hear the huge numbers that advisors recommend for retirement, and it makes me feel woefully unprepared. But those numbers just don't really apply to me if I'm planning on retiring in France. The assumption behind those numbers is that you might rack up massive healthcare costs that you have to pay for out of pocket yourself, and that you need a huge buffer for emergencies that could otherwise wipe you out. But I think in France, you just don't need that much money to retire comfortably. Now, I'm not saying that you should retire with nothing, but the amount that you need is just generally lower. For one thing, fixed costs are just generally lower here as well. Healthcare doesn't cost hundreds of dollars a month in insurance premiums that you have to pay even before you can see a doctor. Your housing costs, whether you rent or own, are probably much more reasonable here than they are in major US cities, for example. And your transportation costs might be lower here as well. Dual income families with kids even can live comfortably here in France on a family budget of about 4,000 euros a month. And that's not necessarily just scraping by, that's living pretty well. And I'm just not sure that that's possible in most of the larger American cities. And the psychological shift is significant too. I'm generally someone who has a lot of anxiety when it comes to money. And I wouldn't say that it's gone away completely by living in France, but it definitely has gone down significantly, especially when it comes to certain things like about healthcare, for example, which we'll talk more about later. And it's definitely not because I suddenly became wealthy by moving to France. It's because the system here doesn't require you to self-insure for every possible catastrophe. I am actively saving and investing for retirement. I want to have more than just my government pension when I retire, but my little nest egg is not going to be in the millions, and that's okay. Long-term care in nursing homes, for example, that's still one area where you need to plan carefully no matter where you plan on growing old. In the US, Medicare doesn't cover for long-term nursing home care or assisted living, only short-term skilled nursing after a hospital stay. If you need long-term care, you're either paying out of pocket or spending down your assets to qualify for Medicaid. The average cost in the US for a nursing home is about $100,000 a year or around $50,000 a year for assisted living. In France, the median cost for retirement homes called EHPADs is around 1,977 euros a month, whereas the average retirement pension in France is about 1,600 euros a month. So people and families have to find a way to make up the difference. But there is a system called APA, Allocation Personnalisée d'Autonomie, that helps cover the dependency care portion regardless of your income. And the medical care that you receive at the EHPAD at the retirement home is covered by the French national healthcare system. So you might not be responsible for having to pay for the entire 2,000 euros a month yourself out of pocket. So yes, you still need to think about the cost of long-term care here, but the scale is very different than in the US. So if you are someone who is thinking about retiring in France, but you're just putting it off, you might want to run the actual numbers because you might be surprised in the end. Now moving on to assumption number 2, which is that healthcare can bankrupt you. This seems like it's one of the biggest sources of financial anxiety for Americans, especially as they get older. I've heard of people in the US who stay in jobs even if they're really unhappy just because the job provides healthcare insurance. That is like an incomprehensible thought here. It just doesn't compute. And I find French people to be relatively risk averse, not really likely to quit a stable job just because they're unhappy. But I have never heard of someone rationalizing staying in a job just for the health insurance benefits. that's just not something that they need to worry about because they know even if they quit their job, they'll still have access to decent healthcare. And specifically for Americans who are planning on retiring early, that gap between retirement and when Medicare kicks in at 65 seems to be one of the biggest obstacles. In America, even with Medicaid, you're juggling supplemental insurance, Part D for prescriptions, copays, deductibles. A serious illness could potentially still cost you tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket. Whereas in France, it's just not like that. For example, doctor's visits cost about 30 euros, and most of that is reimbursed, in fact. Actually, I'm working on a video right now. I've been tracking how much I've had to pay out of pocket for a whole battery of routine healthcare visits over the past 6 months or so because I wanted to be able to report back to you so that you could really get an idea of what the sort of day-to-day French healthcare system looks like for someone who is a patient in the system. So if you're interested in learning more about that, definitely subscribe. That video is coming hopefully in the next few weeks or so. And for me, this really means that there is sort of this like mental burden that is just lifted off of my shoulders in a sense. I'm not lying awake at night wondering if I can afford to get sick or if one medical emergency is going to wipe out everything that I've saved. Being sick is already stressful enough without having to worry about how much it's going to cost. But I understand that for Americans, this fear is not unfounded. Medical bankruptcy is real. According to the Commonwealth Fund, 41% of working age Americans have medical debt or problems paying their medical bills. I've seen stories and I've read studies on people with diabetes in the US, especially those under 65, who ration insulin. And the stories of American families who go into debt or even bankruptcy to cover cancer treatment costs, that's tragic. Of course, I'm not trying to imply that healthcare is completely free here either. Of course, there are the taxes that we pay to have access into the system, but even some treatments are not necessarily that well covered. For example, I've heard of people who have had to pay a lot out of pocket for expensive dental care, for example. For example, my husband just got orthotics and they cost 172 euros and only 75 euros of that was covered, so we had to pay the rest out of pocket. But we're just not talking about the same scale here. Families don't risk losing their houses over these types of expenses. You also don't need to worry about costs in case of an emergency. If you need an ambulance, for example, it's not going to cost you anything out of pocket. When my husband had an emergency gallbladder removal, for example, we worried about him and his health, but not about how much it would cost or if he would lose his job as a result. Versus in 2011, when we were visiting family in the States, I had a medical emergency. I had a scary asthma attack. And so I wound up in the ER. And I just remember I was worried about myself, but I was mainly focused on how much the entire event was going to cost. Well, actually, it turns out that even when we're in the States, we're also covered by the French healthcare system. We have to pay out of pocket, and it's a long process to get reimbursed, but it has happened a few times since then. We've had a couple mishaps when we've been in the States with the kids, for example, and we have managed to get all of our healthcare costs that we have incurred in the States reimbursed here in France. Now, if you're planning on retiring early in France before you're eligible for a retirement pension, you do need to be aware about the PUMA tax, officially called the Cotisation Subsidiaire Maladie. If you're living off investment or rental income above about 23,550 euros per year without any pension income, you'll pay a 6.5% charge on that capital income to cover your healthcare costs. I'll link to the article that I just cited in the video description below because I imagine some of you will want to read this whole article. This is one reason why, even though I personally am planning on working less even before my official retirement age, I probably will continue to work at least part-time until my official retirement age. By keeping some employment, even if it's just part-time employment, it means that I am still paying into the system for my healthcare and thereby hopefully not triggering the PUMA tax. Once you start receiving your pension income, though, you are exempt from this charge. This is all a bit complicated, though, and I'm definitely not an expert, so I would recommend that you consult with a professional to make sure that you have the most accurate information on this. And here's something that I don't hear people talking a lot about. The mutuelle here in France, that's the supplemental health insurance that we have. They are actually non-profit entities under the Code de la Mutualité. They can't distribute profits to shareholders because they don't have any shareholders. Surpluses get reinvested to improve services or reduce what you have to pay. In 2023, the Mutuelle, with an S, returned 81% of contributions to members as benefits, with 19% going to management fees. And one more thing, this is kind of morbid but important. Our mortgage insurance has provisions so that if either my husband or I become incapacitated or die, our mortgages are paid off completely for our house and for all of our rental properties. Are there questions about the French healthcare system's long-term funding? Yes. Do people here still have to pay out of pocket for some of their services that they receive, or some part of the services that they receive? Yes. But we're not talking about whether people can afford life-saving treatments and whether or not they'll lose their homes to have to pay for it. Assumption number 3, you must own a car to have freedom and a good quality of life. Having a car can feel like freedom for some people, and in most of America, you genuinely do need one because everything is so spread out and public transport is either non-existent or unreliable. But here's what that freedom costs. AAA estimates that the average cost of owning a car in the US is over $12,000 per year when you factor in the car payment, depreciation, insurance, gas, maintenance, registration, and parking. And for a lot of people, it's even more. I do have a car, but I hardly ever need to use it. We bought my car in cash for 3,000 euros in December 2018, and in almost 7 years, I've put 4,000 kilometers or about 2,500 miles on it, which is roughly 357 miles per year. And so, unfortunately, we do have some expenses associated with my car. I budget 100 euros a month for gas, insurance, repairs, and tolls for when we go on vacation. I use it so infrequently, I just want to get rid of it, but my husband wants to keep it just in case. Granted, he has a company car, which we can use on the weekend, so we do have access to a proper family car in a sense, but I think we could live without either car, in fact. Why? Because my city, Dijon, like most French cities, is walkable. The public transportation works. There are bike lanes and there are car sharing services for when you actually need a car for a weekend trip. In fact, I just signed up for Cities, the car share service here, just to check it out so that I can report back to you. So stay tuned for that as well. Now, it's different if you're planning on living in rural France, obviously. In that case, you probably will need a car, and that is obviously something that you need to take into account when you're doing your planning. The myth or the assumption is that somehow owning a car equals freedom. But I'd argue that not having a car, not having to drive everywhere, not being stuck in traffic, not having to worry about looking for a parking spot, not having to worry about all of those expensive repairs, for me, not having all of those extra things to worry about, that's actual freedom. Assumption number 4, a high income is the only path to a good quality of life. In the US, there's this belief that if you want a good life, a comfortable life, you need to be making at least 6 figures. If you want to live in a decent neighborhood, access healthcare, save for retirement, maybe take a vacation once in a while, yeah, you need a pretty high income to make that work. Here's what's different in France. Nurses, civil servants, teachers, people like me with modest incomes, we can still live relatively well. I've talked about how modest my teacher's salary is. Most months I take home around 2,000 euros. I aspire to earn a little bit more so that I can save and invest, so that hopefully I can sort of semi-retire before my official retirement age, which is 64. And I would have to keep working full-time like this until age 67 to receive my full retirement benefits. But if I didn't have this sort of uncommon desire to work less before my retirement age, then I could just continue working full-time the way I am right now until my retirement age. And in the meantime, I would be living a decent, comfortable life. Nothing extravagant, but it would be fine. Quality of life in France isn't tied to your salary the way it is so much in America. Instead, it's tied to your access to healthcare, your ability to enjoy cultural activities, the quality of your food, your safety, and your work-life balance. When we were first dating, my husband literally said, "I don't live to work, I work to live," which I definitely didn't fully appreciate at the time, but now I really see the wisdom in that. The French might look less wealthy on paper, but they're actually living very rich lives, just in a different sense. In America, we've conflated high income with quality of life because you need that high income just to be able to access the basics. Here, the basics are covered by social systems, so your income can go more towards living and taking advantages of everything that life has to offer, as opposed to just surviving. Now, I don't want to minimize the fact that there are many poor people here in France, including working poor. But again, the scale is different. The percentage of people living below the poverty line, defined as income below 60% of median income, is 25% in the US compared to 15% in France. How does France manage this? Public spending on social protection, pensions, health insurance, unemployment insurance, which represents 32.2% of GDP in France compared with just 17% in the US. In short, a very protective state in France, less protection in the US. Yes, we pay a lot of taxes here, but for me, that's okay. But the concern now, of course, is whether this generous system is sustainable long term. It is something that I worry about too, and it's another big reason that we are trying to invest and plan ahead. There are ongoing debates and strikes even about reforms, and this is definitely a serious matter that needs to be taken into consideration. French people want to maintain their protections, but those protections come at a high price for the government. Assumption number 5, you have to sacrifice everything to send your kids to college. Many parents in the US open 529 accounts when their kids are babies. They save for 18 years. Some take on second mortgages. Kids and parents go into debt, all to pay for college. The average cost of a 4-year degree at a public university in the US is over $100,000 now. Private universities can be $200,000 to $300,000. It's insane. In France, public universities charge a couple €100 per year, not per credit, per year. Here's what students themselves pay annually in enrollment fees. And these are the prices for students, not just from France, but from the EU, the European Economic Area, and Switzerland. Granted, there are private institutions that cost more, but even those are significantly less expensive than their equivalents in the US. French parents just don't have that same level of burden. Again, that stress just doesn't exist in the same way. Financially, it might be a stretch if you have to find housing for your kid in another city or they decide to go to a private school. But it will not come at the same price as in the US. And the education is good. French universities are well regarded. You're not sacrificing quality, you're just not paying an arm and a leg for it. I told my kids the only way they can go to college in the US is if they get a full scholarship. So, to sum up, 5 money assumptions that don't hold up when you move to France. 1. You don't need a multi-million-dollar nest egg to retire. 2. Healthcare won't bankrupt you. 3. You probably don't need a car. 4. Quality of life isn't dependent on your salary. 5. College won't require a huge financial sacrifice. I'm not saying France is perfect. It's not. There are frustrations and trade-offs. And right now, there's a lot of uncertainty over the future of the entire welfare system. But the financial realities here are so different from what Americans come to believe. And I haven't even talked about some of the non-financial aspects of life here that have real value too. I'll save those for another video. If you're thinking about retiring in France or moving here, I really encourage you to look past these assumptions. Run the actual numbers, talk to people who live here, get real information. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments which of these assumptions surprises you the most. Or if you're already living abroad, what money assumptions did you have to unlearn? If you'd like more of my takes on living abroad as an American, check out this playlist here. Thank you so much for watching today, and until the next time, à bientôt!